Hello, hello.
Hello, Val.
Yes, that's me.
Hello. How are you?
Hi, thank you so much for joining the call.
You're welcome. I
Okay,
think this
so
is the first time we've actually spoken, right? I don't think we've done a podcast together before.
no, it is the first time, and I want to thank you real quick because for the longest time I was on these fandom boards. I was an observer, I think, for a year of the Merc and Half Hope and their talkback show before I actually joined the forum. When I joined the forum, then it was like another couple months before I ever wrote anything, and then another couple months with the fandom before I ever said anything or made a video. And you were one of the biggest supporters of that. So I wanna thank you for that and the encouragement to be more vocal and to do more things and to get more involved.
Cool. That's okay. I mean, that's it's interesting what you're saying because I know people who, even to this day, they like to lurk on forums
Right.
and they
Yeah.
never want to join the conversation. I don't know why. Like it's in my nature to just want to, get all my thoughts out and what have you.
It's interesting, like and it's not just forums. I think it's other areas of my life. I'm like a turtle, so I do a lot of observation, a lot of calculation, a lot of thinking, and it takes longer to say, oh, I could get involved in this. I could take more action. Whereas you're saying you inherently jump into the fray and you get involved in it, and you're already like gung ho into everything.
Pretty much, yeah. It's this idea that most human beings, if not all human beings, I think are, I don't want to use the word scared. I think they're hesitant to do most things because they don't know how to do them for the first time, or they're just not sure about themselves or whatever it is. And it's this idea that the more you make yourself uncomfortable, the more you just try things, the more comfortable you end up being as a person in general.
Right, because you get used to it and it becomes a
Yeah,
pattern.
exactly. So it's like, I mean, and that's it. You find, like, I'm always giving advice like this to people I know, especially when they're doing something big for the first time. And I always say to them, like, the fear is, that build up to doing something that is unknown to you. It's like once you actually do it, you realize, it's not that bad. I can do this. And
That's the thing. Yeah, it's your fear of it is greater than what it actually ends up
exactly,
being.
and it's like that, like pretty much all the time with everything.
Yeah, great lessons in life. That's what it's about. Okay, so one of the things that was an issue during the last time I did an episode like this with a chosen one was this podcast program. Once the battery of my phone needs to be charged or the earpods need to be changed, I drop out of the call in the sense of I can still hear you and it's still recording you.
Okay.
But then I have to send a new link so it could hear me. So just a heads up, if that happened, I have everything charged. I have battery packs here. I have two sets of headphones just in case. But when it does get to that point that it needs to shift, I just send you a new link and then we'll be back on the call.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so welcome to the Mind of Vena, where we're going through one-on-one analysis of different opinions on Batman as a character and a construct. Would you like to introduce yourself real quick for anybody who doesn't know?
I am Andy, aka the Prodigy, and I basically have a big mouth and I like to talk about films a lot.
Yep. You like to talk, but you have from my experience with you as well, you have a very analytical mind where you really can break something down to its core and the different pieces that compose it. So I'm interested to see what you think about Batman because I have a feeling this is going to go in a very interesting direction.
Me too.
And I don't want to ask you the same questions that I did with Chosen One, just because I want to change it up a little bit, get
Okay.
some different perspectives. So here's a variation of a question we opened up with on the last episode, which is Batman has different archetypes that a lot of fans know of. You know, he's a detective, he's a martial artist, some would say a psychopath, bodybuilder, different things like that, vigilante. If you had to give it a percentage, let's say you were writing the Batman character or you were making a Batman film, you know, every director we've seen, they give it a different breakdown in terms of the percentage of what you see. How would you break down that percentage in what your film or your story of Batman would focus on in terms of how much percentage of a focus would you give to detective? How much percentage would you give to martial artist? How much percentage would you give to bodybuilder and the different archetypes of Batman?
My main focus, this is something I won't say I've always wanted to see in a Batman film, but as I've got older, is the fact that he's a psychopath.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that would have to be a huge percentage for me, at least 70%.
Okay.
That has
So
to be
then
the main basis of the movie, yeah.
So if your Batman has a 70% focus on him as a psychopath, would it be similar in tone to a film like Silence of the Lambs or something like that in terms of like a character study?
Oh, 100%, yeah. Would be more like a Taxi Driver.
Or Taxi Driver, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good example as well. How would you approach that? Like, would you approach it in terms of, well, here's Gordon as a commissioner, a police officer, and here's Batman as a psychopath vigilante, or would you have them working together, but then there's a villain that's even more a psychopath? Like, how would you compare him with a 70% focus on that to the other characters in the story?
Well, for me, he basically has to be the most psychotic character in there, aside from possibly the Joker. I'll probably say actually more so as well. Yeah, he has to be like the number one guy, and I don't think I would have a situation where he like. Okay, I should elaborate on this a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I've told the guys in the past, and we've done Batman podcasts and things like that. I'm not actually a Batman fan per se.
Mm-hmm.
I love the overall concept of the character, and there are key elements from comics and films and the cartoon and things like that that I love. But the way I would approach it would be completely different. I think that's because of my love of cinema.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the reasons I really liked Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, because I've always had this idea that I want to see these types of characters done like real films, and by real films I mean things like Taxi Driver. You know, those 1970s type dramatic thrillers. So my ideal movie of Batman, what I would want to see, is an ultra realistic take on the character, whereby the way we think of Batman being this, it's like, you know, you said before, a true interpretation of Batman has to be fantasy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So my version would be the super realistic version that gives life to that fantasy, i.e., he exists in that world, or there is a version in that world of comic books and cartoons, whatever, based on this vigilante going out there and pummeling people.
So from the sounds of it, it would be, you know, like the films from the 70s, or even like a film like Bronson, in terms of it wouldn't really be like a superhero film or an action film as much as So when you say it sounds like your version would be more realistic than Nolan. It sounds like it would be more like a character like the Punisher, or more like a character that, like how would you approach the outfit? Would he have an outfit? Would he not have an outfit? Would it be like he's doing these things and it's a psychological character study, but then people have an impression of him and a fantasy of him that's based off the reality of what he actually is, but the fantasy is like completely different and completely like almost people saying myths, or talking about this person that's doing these things, but they've never actually seen him.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
So that's interesting. So then that's a very different take in terms of, one, I don't think that's ever really been done. I don't, thinking back to a lot of the comic books, I think the closest thing in the comic books was Arkham Asylum, because I think, from what I remember, that was presented in a way where it was distorted from the narration into like a fantastical element, but you got the sense that maybe that's not what was going on. It was maybe more a realistic world, but the narration and the narrator was presenting it in a distortion and a fantastical way. Whereas all the other stories are your typical comic book type of stories. So 70% psychopath. How would the other percentages break down? Would it be more martial arts, more detective, or something completely different? Would it be more Bruce Wayne? And if your focus on Batman is such as like a focus on the psychopathic element, what would your Bruce Wayne be like in terms of? Would there be a difference between the two sides of how you're viewing them, or what would that Bruce Wayne side look like?
So most of the time when you would see Bruce in my ideal version, he's no different from Batman, except he's not wearing the costume, which, again, like I was saying, in my version, you asked before about the costume, it would be more of a DIY costume that he's put together.
Do-it-yourself put together suit.
And the point I was going to say before, when I kind of got sidetracked about this, is I wouldn't have him working directly with Gordon in my version, because it's unrealistic for a police officer or commissioner to entertain working with a vigilante. But I would have Batman kind of leaving clues and breadcrumbs and things like that for Gordon in order to aid the police. But I wouldn't have them, directly together. But yeah, so it's like, it's something that you've spoken about when you did that big epic series on Batman, is this idea that, his real personality is Batman. Mm-hmm. There's this line towards the end of Kill Bill that Tarantino wrote, and obviously he's a big comic book guy, where he's talking about how much he loves Superman, because Superman's, the only superhero who his real persona is him in that outfit. He's like, everyone else has to put on the outfits to become that person. I always thought, it sounds cool in the movie, but it's wrong, right? So, Batman is Bruce Wayne. That's how he is, right? So, yeah, in my version, that the way he would conduct himself, the way he would talk, all of that would still carry through when he's Bruce, unless he's in a situation where he has to put on a performance and, like a sociopath, pretend to be normal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's that thing where it's so much of the character is trauma, and we call that aspect, like, your interpretation sounds like it would be a very psychological film, mm-hmm. or a very psychology focused film, and the natural examples that I think of, because I'm interested to see where the plot of a film like that would go in your version, because I think it's very different from what most people would expect. Like, for example, when you watch Taxi Driver or you watch Silence of the Lambs, where those two films go plot-wise, they're very character study focused films. They focus on the psychology of the characters, but what inevitably happens with both films is in the third act, because they're so internally focused, you have an outward explosion of a reflection of the state of mind of the character, or that's how they derive a more epic scope. So, for example, the ending of Taxi Driver, everybody knows that climactic ending and that last 5 minute sequence. It's a very atmospheric and visual sequence and a very action-oriented sequence, but it's like a externalization of the character's internal psychology that was bottled up for the whole plot of the film. And then likewise, Silence of the Lambs in the third act in the last 5 minutes is a similar externalization, but I always loved the way Silence of the Lambs did it, because the way it did it was kind of like it broadened the scope. Like, here's a guy that we've been character studying the whole time that's been locked up in a cell. We've had these psychology-focused interactions, and now he's slithering away into anonymity within a crowd like a spider or a snake that just got out of its cage, and it broadens the horror of the film, because it's horror in the subliminal sense. Like, it's giving you horror because you're realizing the scope of now this guy is free in the world, versus your typical horror that's like sensationalism and gore and blood and that kind of stuff, even though it had elements of that. Yeah. Would your Batman film follow those two examples, or would it be a little different in terms of how it utilizes the Gordon character, and what would you do with Alfred?
Interesting. I would definitely think that it would go down that type of route, because it's going to be psychology based. So, like, going back to Joker, because see, this is the thing. One of the criticisms I saw about Joker from comic book fans, from Batman fans, was that he's nothing like the character's meant to be, and a lot of people, even people who like the film, I've seen try to justify it by saying this isn't the real Joker. This is like a proto Joker, and the real Joker's a copycat, which I don't like that idea at all. Why I liked it so much? I mean, there's lots of reasons, obviously the performance, etc. But ultimately, it's this idea that the best villains are the heroes of their own story. When you watch that movie, yes, some people can watch it and he does obviously go off the rails, obviously kills people, etc. But you can also empathize with him. You can at least try to understand his point of view, and it kind of goes back to this idea as well I was talking about earlier, which is, as far as that particular version of the Joker is concerned, he isn't this monster that everyone thinks he is. But that can kind of become his legacy, especially when you had, the gangs wearing the clown masks and all that, right? So again, in that world, you can have this perception of him, which is more like he is in the comic books. He's this, maniac going around killing people. But the actual real character in the film isn't. He's just a disturbed individual. And like I said, I think my Batman would be like that as well. And it's a similar thing where there's a lens through which you can watch the movie. We're like, this guy is a bad guy. He's scary. And
it's also, going off your points, I think a lot of people don't give Joker enough credit, because the criticism usually is, like you said, one, that it's not the Joker of the comic books, but also that it's simplistic. But when you look at it, it's not that simplistic. It is very nuanced in terms of the performance. If you've ever seen any character studies or any news reels or any documentaries about sociopaths or killers or anything like that, uh, there's always these little subtle things in the body language or the character psychology or their dialogue or their what they say. There's like the narcissism, which you see obviously in Joker. There's the narcissistic anger. There's the revelry. Once he kills someone for the first time and he's dancing to that music in the, I think it was the bathroom that he stumbles upon from the subway. And you see it in moments where he's preparing for his interview. You see it in moments where he's in his living room and he can't stop shaking his leg and he can't stop moving in a certain way. And I've seen those things before in sociopaths and narcissistic character studies or documentaries in real life. So I don't understand the criticism that it's simple, because I do think the performance is nuanced. And like you said, it's the lens. I correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's been any comic book movie where you get the feeling like the films of the 70s where they're looking at a character under a magnifying glass and it's a very narrow focus. That is the film. And people say, well, if it wasn't for Joaquin Phoenix, then the script wasn't that great, and the movie is bad and this and that. But that's the point of these character study types of films. It is the performance that carries the whole film. And the only reason it's so character focused and performance focused is because you eliminate everything else. So it has to be that way. Like when you see these other films and they have everything else going on with CGI and action set pieces and stuff, those things in a way hinder a very narrow character focus. So when you get that character focus in Taxi Driver, in Silence of the Lambs, in Joker, it's not really a valid point to criticize the film and say, well, if it wasn't for that performance, this is a bad film and there's nothing else in it. But that's the point. It's structured in that way. So, I mean, would you agree with that?
100%.
And it's, which brings up another point. If you approach Batman that way, a lot of those types of films, they don't have too many, like they don't have like a large cast of characters like what you would see in The Dark Knight or this new Batman movie coming out. They don't have a large amount of action set pieces like what you would see in Spider-Man 2 from Sam Raimi or any of these movies or comic book movies. They're simple. The plot is geared around the psychology of the character. It is that type of film. So would you utilize all the characters to a degree? Like, would you have a Lucius Fox? Would you have an Alfred? Would you have a Gordon? One villain or multiple villains? Or would you really bare bones, like, look, the majority of the screen time is the actor that's playing Batman. When he's Bruce Wayne. Second to that is the villain. And then third to that is maybe split between Gordon and Alfred.
Exactly that. It would have to focus, fully on Batman. So I would only go with one main villain. Obviously Alfred and Gordon would be featured. Gordon would be, a supporting character. Again, there probably wouldn't be many, if any, scenes where he's, actually sharing the screen with Batman. To be honest, I don't think. I'm trying to think back. Were there many scenes in Batman '89 with Gordon and Batman together?
No, Gordon was a very limited character in that, from what I remember. It wasn't really the Gordon that, say, Gary Oldman was. But the other thing, too, is Batman '89, when you talk about percentages, it was Batman '89 and Batman Returns, in my opinion, when you look at all the Batman films, that was the only one that had all of those archetypical elements where you never had any one of the elements to a large degree, like you didn't have like more than 50% on any element, but you had all the elements. There was very little percentage of martial artists, but it was there. There was a very limited sense of detective, but it was there. There was a very small sense of psychopath, but it was there in terms of trauma or psychopath or grief and that kind of thing. I don't think any of the other versions had all of the elements in small degrees. I think they had certain elements over other elements that were omitted, that weren't in the films at all altogether. But yeah, it's one of those things. It was the most balanced, and yours is interesting because I'm assuming it would be rated R.
Oh yeah, it would have to be.
Right off the bat. How much? So he's 70% psychopath, and you're focusing on a character study. How much of an element would the Batcave be? Would he be spending a lot of time in the Batcave? Would he take villains to the Batcave? Would he hide in the Batcave? What's going on with the Batcave?
The Batcave would have to be his main domicile. That's where he spends most of his time.
So he's living essentially in
because
the
he's a psycho, yeah.
I'm very interested to hear the interaction between your Batman, Bruce Wayne, and Alfred. What does that look like?
I think the only way Alfred can fit into this, where obviously he knows who he is and what he's doing, and I wouldn't say he helps him, but he looks after him. And this would probably stem from the relationship he had with his parents, or at least his dad, and maybe a promise he made, and the fact that maybe, Alfred is alone. He's got no one else or nowhere else to go to, and he's kind of made it his life's mission to try and take care of this psychopathic guy that he essentially raised, and it's hard for him. This is a guy who he would break down, every day, every few days. It's a chore for him. It's not something he enjoys doing, but it's his duty. I suppose you could probably explore in a minor way the psychology of that character in the movie as well. I think that's the only way you could fit Alfred in.
It becomes, because that's the closest character to him, right? So Alfred is the closest character to him, and the other films that we mentioned, they sort of had a character like that, right? So Silence of the Lambs, you had Charisse, what was the character's name? Sterling, Clarice Sterling, and that was the character that kind of lets you see the psychology of Hannibal Lecter. I'm assuming Alfred would be the character that lets you see the psychology of Bruce Wayne Batman, because that's the only character that would be close enough to him to kind of bring that out from an internal space. So a lot of the film would take place, I'm assuming, in the mansion and the Batcave. Would you show him? Would you show fight scenes? Would you not show fight scenes and just show the aftermath of the fight scenes, like Alfred patching him up, that kind of thing? And villains, how did they come into play? So if Batman is the psychopath, what do the actions of the film look like? Is he doing detective work? Is he pummeling people and torturing them and beating them up? Is he dealing with psychological issues like grief or other psychological profiles himself? And if there's such a focus on your Batman psychologically, what do your villains in this world look like? Are they also super realistic? And what are some of your takes on some of those villains?
Okay, let's do this one bit at a time. All right, so let's go with the villains. The villains would have to fit in. They would have to be ultra realistic, and you could approach villains differently. For example, the Batman I'm talking about can exist in the universe of the Joker movie. There's no reason he couldn't, and he could even have this obsession where this Joker character is this heinous villain, and he has to take him down at all costs and blah blah blah. Whereas the reality, from the Joker's perspective, he's not. This obviously he's a maniac, but he's not this demented serial killer, right? The way that Batman would think of him and want to pursue him. A lot of it would be
Your
perspective.
Batman would be a little unhinged in that what we're seeing from him as the main character isn't completely accurate.
Oh yeah, because that's how crazy people are. you know, um,
Right.
that's how. I mean, there was elements of that in the Joker as well, but that's exactly what it would be. Like my Batman would be more like American Psycho than Nolan's Batman trilogy.
And it's funny since that was
Exactly.
Christian
Yeah.
Bale in American Psycho.
But yeah, some of the villains could just be, sort of how you would see regular, gangsters in the real world. You could have something a bit more extreme, like a serial killer as well. And I don't want to shit all over the comics and things like that. Obviously, my whole reasoning is that I'm approaching it differently. I'm trying to make like a serious film, like a proper film, right? So you do your own version of it using what's there in the source material. So, for example, you could easily have the Riddler as a serial killer, and he leaves riddles for who his intended next victim would be, because that's how he gets off. That's his thing. But you do it in a realistic way, maybe something along the lines of David Fincher's Seven. Yeah, it depends on the particular villain. Obviously, ones who are a bit more fantastical, Clayface or something like that, I wouldn't have. Because I don't like the idea where you can take a fantastical villain and try to make them realistic. I know the whole thing is fantastic when I'm trying to make it realistic, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about, and it doesn't work because it's funny. Me and you are actually on completely opposite ends of the spectrum in the terms of you're taking a completely ultra realistic approach, whereas I would take a completely fantastical approach. And you're right. The villains that I would use are all the fantastical villains, which you wouldn't use because the villains you would use are the realistic villains. So you can do it where you take the fantastical villains and you make them realistic, but then you're taking away what makes the characters interesting. And you can take the realistic villains and make them fantastical, but again, you're taking away what makes those characters interesting. So I want to dig deeper into this idea because you mentioned some of the villains, and they might, like the Joker, for example, might not be all as bad as you're seeing him from Batman's perspective, which makes sense. And I want to try an exercise, which is, we all like to say about faithfulness for comic books, and what's when the material's departing the source and it's different or it's a new interpretation, but it's a very interesting thing because after watching Dark Knight Rises, I was so that film just rubbed me the wrong way. So I ended up writing to kind of therapy myself, and I ended up writing Batman. And what happened is, at first it was very traditional and faithful to the comics, and everything was very by the books. And at one point I asked myself a question, and that was, what if what if you had the ability to start from a blank slate? What would you do with this character? How would you change it? What would you uniquely put into this creation that's uniquely your own? And that proved to be a good exercise because a lot of changes happened that I never would have assumed would have happened, and it completely changed the characters, the dynamics, everything. So I'm going to apply that question to you. What if you approached it the way that you're saying, where Batman's the psychopath, and what if every one of his villains in this story or in this film has a little bit more humanity than his perspective is showing us? And what if that's the pattern and the paradigm and the way the plot is structured through your premise, that all these villains are bad? Maybe they have psychological issues, but they're not as bad as what we're seeing it from Batman's perspective because he has his own issues. So if you were to approach it that way, which one of the characters would work the best in that way? Which one would be the strongest character in terms of humanity already in them? And would you change any other characters? Again, feel free to go completely away from the comics. Feel free to completely depart from the source. Through that lens, would some of these characters have to change drastically? And what would those drastic changes be to make the Batman character stronger in contrast?
Yeah, I think they would all have to change to some degree, like you said, to show their humanity, and not to keep going back to it. But I think, you know, the Joker movie is a strong example of that, of how you change a character and give him more humanity. Like I said, he is in that movie the hero of his own story as far as he's concerned. And obviously, if you're doing a serial killer version of the Riddler, I suppose you could give him a reasoning like the John Doe character in Seven, where he knows what he's doing is quote unquote bad, you know, killing people, but he's doing it for a reason. You know, he's trying to make a point ultimately. Yeah, every it doesn't matter who you're using, whether it's, you know, Penguin or whatever. It's I would want to see, you know, a bit of humanity in those characters. Make them more, you know, 3-dimensional, so they're not just the bad guy, although that is how Batman looks at him. You know, I'm trying to think.
And we're getting
see, like, for me, the villains that keep coming to mind are the Joker, the Riddler. So even if I was to do a version of the Penguin, it would be nothing like what Tim Burton did. It would be more of a traditional gangster type, I suppose. Yeah, see, I think you start getting limited with villains that way, because this is what your whole point was, that Batman ultimately is a fantasy. So if you're going to do it properly, like the comics, it has to be full on. And obviously what I'm trying to do is a completely different version, like I said. Exactly. Whereas in my world, there are these Batman comics that exist that look at the character like he's this mythological being. Obviously, no one actually knows he's Bruce Wayne, so that isn't in those particular comics. But it's yeah. I mean, you couldn't use characters like Ra's al Ghul, because then you'd have to do what Nolan did essentially, and find a way to make him eternal in a really,
which doesn't
work, because you're basically butchering the character. I mean, the character was Descartes, ultimately, in that movie, in Batman Begins.
And it's funny because it's like if you were to say what they wanted to do with Superman, which again is the same type of lot. Let's make Superman realistic. Why would you ever make Superman realistic? That's like suicide. I mean, that's just doesn't make any logical sense. You can do what you're saying with Batman, because Batman is such a psychologically focused character already. He doesn't have any powers already. There's elements in there where you could take it that way, but there's no elements in Superman where you would ever want a realistic Superman, or where that would ever work. So it's like that type of thinking that doesn't work.
100%.
Because fantasy is fantasy and real life is real life.
To do a realistic version of Superman would basically have to focus on... it would be like an E.T. type thing, where the government is basically trying to capture an alien being. Who has all these amazing superpowers. Like it's, you know, you can't actually make a realistic Superman movie. It works for Batman because, you know, he doesn't have any powers. It is very psychology based. And remember, what I'm doing ultimately is I'm looking at it from a particular angle, and I'm just focusing on that. So there would be a lot of Batman fans who would watch, you know, what my ideal version is and say I reject this, you know.
Well, here's the thing. It's a gradient, so it depends on the person. Uh, I could watch a version like what you're describing is like me watching the Joker. Now, why I can watch the Joker or what you're describing, and I would have no issue with it because I would understand what's being done, and I would say, okay, this is not my approach, but I like this approach because I like films like Taxi Driver, I like films like Joker, I like films like Silence of the Lambs. I get the structure, I get what they're doing, right? I get the approach. The thing with Nolan that I didn't like is he was trying to do something in between. And I've said this before that I'm an extremist. So if you're going to give me the option between left and right, I'll take left, I'll take right, but I don't like the middle. Yeah. I don't like gray. And he did gray, so he gets none of the strengths that you get from the ultra left that you get with your approach or the ultra right that you would get with the approach that I would take. And you end up in the middle, and it's not bad, it's not good, it's not the worst, it's not the greatest. It's like a very muddled thing that has no characteristic signature on it. There's no it's almost like a non-take. It's not really a take to say I'm going to take this character, keep some of the fantastical elements, make it a little bit realistic, and then you can buy both sides. Like you could buy that this is the real world and he's dressed as a bat like this in the real world and he's acting in this way. Because ultimately when I watch those films, I don't buy it. It's not buyable. If it was 100% fantasy, I would buy it. If it was 100% realistic, I would buy it. But because he's in between, I can't buy into it. For some reason, I just can't do it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although, see, it's weird. I think Batman Begins is a good film.
It is. Yeah.
I don't enjoy it anymore the way I used to because I feel like it is tainted by the sequels. And I know most people thought The Dark Knight was the best, but see, the thing with The Dark Knight is it's exactly like what you were just saying, where it ended up with this blandness to it, where the only real highlight is the Joker. And The Dark Knight Rises was similar. Again, Bane was the main highlight, but The Dark Knight Rises just had a bad plot, and it just wasn't a real.
You know what's funny? That's interesting. That I just thought of when you brought it up is that he did this. He did this in between approach, right? You in The Dark Knight, you even had certain panels that were lifted directly from the comics, like when Gordon and Dan and Batman meet on the rooftop from Long Halloween, right? Which I hated completely because, like I said, if it's the comics and it's fantasy, go all the way or don't do it at all. But the strengths of his film, when you think about it, he walked this line in between. The Batman character suffered greatly because it was in between, and that's the character that was hit the worst by that approach. That was literally the character that was hit the worst is Batman. But when you think of the other characters, when you think of the approach that you're taking, character study film, psychologically focused, performance oriented, like Joaquin Phoenix in the Joker, where a lot of the screen time would be with your Batman character. That's what happened with his films. In a roundabout way, he took the middle approach. So he completely destroyed the Batman character, not going left or right. But then the best things about his films was the Joker in The Dark Knight with Heath Ledger, was Tom Hardy as Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. And when you look at that, it's like, well, character study, character performance. Without Heath Ledger, Dark Knight is not that great. Without Tom Hardy's Bane, and you see this even a little bit towards the end of Dark Knight Rises, when they subvert the character and they make him just a henchman, completely destroys what he did with the rest of the film, which is funny because the strongest elements of Christopher Nolan's films were the character study, psychological performances from Heath Ledger and Tom Hardy, and the weakest elements had to do with how he, as a director, approached the material. So when people say Christopher Nolan, as a director, did a good job with his films, he completely failed because Heath Ledger did a great job as an actor. Tom Hardy did a great job as an actor. You know, Joaquin Phoenix did a great job in The Joker as an actor, and the director supported that in the film, I think, very well. But it's almost like the directing in The Dark Knight and the directing in The Dark Knight Rises, their acting performances were so good that it didn't destroy the acting performances, but I can't say he succeeded as a director for the film as a whole, because if it wasn't for those two performances, what were his films when it comes to the character of Batman, or even as believable films that you can buy in? Like, his approach was a failure in a way because it didn't make any logical sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think my theory is that he just wanted to make a big budget movie, and the option to do Batman Begins came up. And I feel that, like I said, I do think it's a good movie. My enjoyment of it is tainted by the sequels, but I think one of the reasons that actually worked well is because he had to stick more to script. I think Goya was the main writer on that, and it it looked a certain way. Like you watch it and you believe, yeah, that's a version of Gotham, and I think it became so successful. And this is the thing. The success wasn't just financial, because it didn't do that well. Like, it did well enough to breathe life back into the franchise, but it was the critical response that was overwhelming, and a lot of people wanted to jump on that bandwagon. And Nolan obviously was becoming a bigger name as well. So when it got time to do the sequel, I think he basically won't go as far as say he had carte blanche, but he had a lot more leeway to do what he wanted. So he ultimately abandoned so many key elements of the Batman universe, which is why, I mean, the city, I mean, Gotham looks nothing like it does in Batman Begins. And there's nothing about it that makes you feel like you're in Gotham. It just, I mean, it looks like Chicago. And
It is. It's
I think there are even street signs and store signs that say Chicago because they forgot to, change them, or they just left them all.
I don't think it's even that they forgot. It's one of those things where, like you said, his hands were tied a little bit with Batman Begins because it was coming after Batman and Robin, and Goyer was involved. So really, he did have to follow the playbook, right? It was bringing it back from Batman and Robin, so it wasn't going to be his take. With Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises, like you said, because of the success, and you don't really see it as much with Dark Knight, you see it more with Dark Knight Rises, because with Dark Knight, it was almost like the perfect storm, and that movie was such a phenomenon. I remember when it came out, there were so many elements. Heath Ledger passing away, Heath Ledger's performance. Like, there were so many, what was done with Batman Begins already. There were so many perfect storm elements that came together at the same time to make that film the ultra success that it was. And I can't say that was because of Christopher Nolan. He was involved in the project and he got a lot of that credit. If you remember correctly, after Dark Knight, actors started praising him as one of the greatest directors ever. People started looking at him like, he can do no wrong. And really, because of that, from that point, Dark Knight Rises is when he was really free to say, okay, do what you want. And it was the worst of the three. because he fully did what he actually wanted to do with the beginning, which I don't think he was ever interested in the Batman character. Like your approach, it's left, but it's an interest in the Batman character. My approach, it's right, but it's an interest in the Batman character. They're two opposite ends of the spectrum, left and right, but it's a focus on the character. I don't think he was ever interested in the Batman character per se, one way or the other, as much as you say that he wanted to do a blockbuster film that was critically successful and financially successful, so then he can sort of have that cachet to do things that he wanted to do with other films and to, be in a financial position that allows him more freedom as a director, sort of say.
That's exactly right, 100%. And it I mean, everything you said there is correct, and it sounds, terrible to say, but I do think it's true, and I thought it was true at the time. I think
he was at the right place
well,
at the right
there's
time.
that, but I was going to talk about, Heath Ledger's untimely passing. That was a major factor for the film's financial success. No one wanted to. I mean, obviously, to the average person, they don't really think about these things. But guys like us, film fans, people just didn't really want to talk about it because it sounds quite morose, I mean, I knew people, even years after the film came out, they thought he had committed suicide. And I remember the media was going on about this obsession with the Joker character and how, you have to go to a really dark place when you're playing it. And they were asking these questions to like Jack Nicholson, and it was so ridiculous. It was basically an accidental mixture of medication, essentially, that killed him. But it added so much kind of intrigue to people wanting to see the film. On top of that, the Joker character himself is such a big pull. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the Joaquin Phoenix movie made over $1 billion, and that's why Todd Phillips wanted to do it that way. If you had the exact same movie, but it wasn't about the Joker and it was called something else, it may not have even made the profit. I don't know, it would have been a good film, but, how many people would have gone to see it? And this is also one of the, I know I'm going back to talking about Joker, but this is one of the reasons I've seen people criticize the film who don't like it and say, oh, Todd Phillips didn't even want to do, a Joker movie or, in a Batman universe movie. He just wanted to do a character study, but the only way he could get the studio to agree was to base it on a well-known, comic book character. And that's true, but it doesn't mean that he didn't take care with crafting a good film. And there's there's a few Easter eggs in there, and you can see, like, just watching it the first time round, I could see that he may not be a huge Batman fan and care about that universe, but he took enough care with the movie to make sure those things were in there, and I appreciate that. I thought we did a good job with it. But I was obviously talking about The Dark Knight and how Heath's death and just the fact that the Joker was in it added to it. And then, the fact that Batman Begins was so highly acclaimed, there was a lot of people jumping on the bandwagon, And
it's I remember people, I knew a lot of people that only saw it because of Heath Ledger and because of his death and what happened, and like you said, the intrigue surrounding the role and surrounding the film, that otherwise would not have seen that film, that didn't even know there was a Batman Begins, didn't even see Batman. I know so many people that saw The Dark Knight and then they were like, wait a minute, there was a Batman Begins.
I knew a couple of people like that.
Like there was a film before this one. So it's like you said, the financial success of Batman Begins wasn't that great. It was critically well received and it was a good film. Batman fans saw it, but the financial success was nowhere near The Dark Knight. And a lot of the financial success, I have to say, had to do one way or the other with Heath Ledger. And a lot of the intrigue, because like I said, I know so many people that saw The Dark Knight multiple times that never even saw Batman Begins, and some that still to this day have not seen Batman Begins. But from The Dark Knight, because of Heath Ledger's performance, that kind of filtered into The Dark Knight Rises, and then people were more aware of that film. But it just goes to show that it was like a storm of events that culminated at the same time that contributed to the success of the film. But what naturally happens with any of these films, when they go bad, they always blame it on the wrong thing. When they go right and they're super successes, they always give credit to the wrong, a lot of times to the wrong thing. And what ended up happening is a lot of the credit, if not all the credit, went to Christopher Nolan. And that's something I never understood. Like, I get it. He was the guy running the ship. But the amount of praises that he got after The Dark Knight, came out was like over the moon. Of like, it was almost like overinflating like the director, because Christopher Nolan's a good director with thrillers and certain films, but at least The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, I would say they're not great adaptations and they're not exactly good films. But he's not that much better than a director that, like, say like Mel Gibson is a director, or say, anybody else is a director that, for the most part, stays within their strengths and does films that are within their ballpark. It is one of those things that, he got a lot of that credit. What do you think about the other people that have done Batman films in terms of compared to your approach? Like, when you look at the films that we've already had, and let's throw Joker in there, so including Todd Phillips with Joker, Burton with Batman 89 and Returns, Joel Schumacher with Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, and Christopher Nolan. How do you place them? Because there's two elements. There's being a Batman fan and there's being a film fan and looking at them as films. So I gather you're not too much into the Batman comics, so you're going to lean more towards a film fan perspective.
Yeah. I mean, overall, for me, the best one is Joker. And mainly because, it was approached like it was a real film. I mean, again, there's criticisms that it relies too heavily on its influences, on King of Comedy and Taxi Driver. But those are the types of films that come to mind when, like what I was talking about, I want to see, where you think you want to see a 1970s type serious movie. Of course, they took it like a step extra and actually set it. I think it was meant to be set in 1918, but it has, obviously, early 80s has that, late 70s feel to it. But yeah, Joker would be my top one. By Batman Begins, I think there is, if that trilogy kept with the tone of Batman Begins, if it had the same look as well, that more sort of gothic look. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the structure of the films changed. I mean, Batman Begins, because it was Nolan's first big movie, he still made it like it was an art house film. You had like the non-linear storytelling and things like that. I think if that followed through for the whole trilogy, I think I would have loved it. Like I said, he kind of abandoned it, went his own route after that. So after Begins, I would probably go with Tim Burton's 89. And there's a lot of things I didn't like about it. There's also a lot of things I liked about it. And one of them, Gotham had this very but it was like a timeless city. Like it had elements from like the 1930s and the 1980s, and it's this weird, like it's the sort of city where you can see any like kind of old school classic superheroes like the Shadow or the Green Hornet or any, similar to Batman, these types of characters. You can see them operating there.
And the guy, the set designer who designed Gotham City for Tim Burton, I saw a documentary once where he talked exactly about that he took elements from different time periods and fused them together into the design so that it is a timeless design where you recognize elements but you don't recognize elements. You can't place certain things but you kind of can place them, and it's sort of this like ability to it, like you said, that's timeless. It could be any one of these heroes in a sense.
Yeah, I thought there was a lot of strengths with that movie, but then there was, I mean, I don't want to start trashing it, but there was other things as well that.
Well, what do you let's delve a little bit into the trashing. So, what do you think were elements that you did not like?
Well, something I'm going to say now is going to wind up a lot of people. I think Michael Keaton was miscast.
How so?
So, this is actually something you spoke about, on these epic videos you did of Batman.
Mm-hmm.
For me, Batman has to physically be a monster. This guy has to be this huge presence who looks like he can punch through brick walls.
Yep.
He has to be. It's like, we're talking before about Superman and whatever. Superman only needs to look like that from a visual representation. He can look big and powerful, but realistically, he can just be a normal guy. He's still super powered. He doesn't need muscles.
You see that with the Superboy character. Usually he's not that big, but he's Superboy, so he's got the strength, and all that type of stuff.
Yeah. Whereas Batman, especially, the version I want to see, he can't look like a normal guy. He so you spoke at the beginning about these different elements. Probably the second thing I would have in terms of importance after him being a psychopath is his physicality mixed with his fighting ability. Him being this martial artist, because you can have a realistic situation where you have a guy who's so big and skilled at fighting that he can go out on the street and beat the shit out of a small group of thugs. Within reason.
You see it all the time in with UFC. There's fighters that from the UFC on the street with any regular guy could take them apart.
The UFC is a great example because you take a martial artist. Let me use Conor McGregor because obviously everyone knows who he is. Yeah. Conor's smaller than average guy. I think he's about 5'8", maybe 5'9" tops. He's and obviously an elite fighter for his weight classes. He's been champion of multiple weight classes, and of course he could beat the shit out of regular guys who are 6'6", who don't have any kind of martial arts background because he's a professional killer essentially. Right? That's what he does every day of his life. But the moment you put him against a guy that size who is also a trained killer, a professional fighter, he's got no chance. You see some of these big heavyweights.
Like if you put him with Brock Lesnar or Chuck Liddell or any one of those guys.
You see guys like, I don't know if you're familiar with Alistair Overeem. This guy looks like a monster. He looks like if there was a bar fight, he would just clear out the entire bar. And I've always pictured Batman like that. He needs to be this huge guy, as well as obviously having the martial arts ability. Because when I see Michael Keaton, I don't buy it. And that was one of the problems Warner Brothers had when they were making the movie, when they cast him. Obviously, this is pre-internet, but they got loads of fan mail, basically saying they
Hate
weren't
mail.
happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, hate mail, saying they weren't happy with Michael Keaton. And I love Michael Keaton. I think he's a phenomenal
You,
actor. I think he's very
you,
underrated as an actor.
that's what it is. There's certain actors, like from a Batman perspective, he's not a good fit. I think he did a good job with the Batman role, but it's one of those things where, to be honest, there's certain actors where I'm biased. So there's certain actors that no matter what movie they're in, I just like their performances. Michael Keaton is one of those actors. Like any movie Michael Keaton's in, I just think he's an interesting actor, and I like what he usually does and the choices that he makes. And there's certain actors like that. I think we all have certain actors where any movie that they're doing, there are sensibility, there are type of style, like the choices that they make as actors we generally like. Like there's certain actors that are your favorite actors, and whatever role they're in, you're like, yeah, I was going to be down with this performance no matter what, because this is one of my favorite actors, right? So that's one of those things. Do you see any validity or any merit in the Joel Schumacher Batman Forever and Batman Robin at all? Or do you have any bright things that you like from those two films?
The only thing he did that I thought was interesting, because other than what I'm about to say, no, I think they're ridiculous. And by the way, after Batman 89, I would probably put Batman Returns, even though I've got other issues with that. And then I'd obviously put Nolan's.
What are your issues with Batman Returns?
So,
and do you look at it as very different from Batman 89, or do you look at them the same?
I look at it like it's very different. I look at it like it's I've said this before. It's similar to what Chris Nolan did after Batman Begins, where Tim Burton had more leeway. So the whole film, Batman Returns, the look of it, everything is more Tim Burton than Batman '89 was. I mean, I remember watching the movie and thinking parts of the set looked more like a Dr. Seuss.
In your opinion, was that a better take for Batman than '89,
No,
or was it worse?
It was worse. I don't want to see I think, like I said, Batman '89. I think visually, tonally, they did a very good job with it. Returns was more, Tim Burton. See, this is the other thing as well. We always say, as film fans, we want to see directors with their voice on screen. But what happens when you get someone like Tim Burton, who, when it gets to Returns, he would rather favor his own sensibilities, over, the source, and obviously Nolan did the same. Once he got to The Dark Knight, he moved away from, the way Gotham should look and feel, and all that.
Really, but I think with most directors, that's what would happen, right? Think of the greatest directors. The greatest directors have a technical mastership over their craft, but they also have a very strong vision. They also have very strong take or signature, and they usually the greatest directors have a very strong understanding of narrative and story structure and things like that. Any Kubrick film you watch is going to be very Kubrick.
Yeah.
It's going to have any Hitchcock film you watch is going to be very Hitchcocky, and you're going to have a very strong signature. I agree. I think that their sensibility going onto the source material is inevitable. The question is, how much does that person's sensibility match up or differ from the source? And there are perfect storms where you get someone like Richard Donner in Superman, or you get someone like, you get people that their sensibility is really well matched to the source where it kind of works really well. You get people like Nolan where it's completely different, or you get people where it's completely different and it's bad, and you get people where it's completely different and it's good. So I think there's almost three different variations of how that situation can go.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's true, and ideally, you want someone who matches up well with the source material in the first place. Even if,
right.
like with me, you want to go and do your own take on it, but there's still, like I said, I love the concept of Batman, so I've got quite a clear idea of, what I want. It's just whether that's for everybody or not. But essentially, what I would be doing is what these guys did with their sequels, not with the first movie, because obviously the first movie they're more reined in. If you watch, either Batman and Batman Returns or Nolan's movies, if you watch them back to back, it's quite obvious the difference from one movie to the other. I mean, this is what we're talking about now is pretty much a conversation I had with someone the other day. We're talking about Netflix movies, Netflix originals. And we're talking about generally the direction cinema is going in. And that was one of the topics that came up. And one of the key things for me is there's a lot of directors who I think are good. They've worked in the studio system and what have you, done good work. When they go to Netflix, their movies are average at best. Some of them are quite poor. And as I'm watching some of these films, I'm thinking to myself, this is the direct result of not having someone watching over them and reining them in, just letting them go and do what they want. And it's weird, right? Because as not just film fans, but people who are filmmakers to one degree or another, that's what you want. You just want, your own vision and everything. But
I think it also depends where it's coming from. For example, it's distinctive. So there's certain directors, like you say, where they really need to be reined in, otherwise they go off the rails. And then there's other directors that nobody should ever rein in because they're always instinctively right. The masters and the greats.
Exactly.
Like
I was going to get to this, yeah.
And then there's sometimes in the history of cinema where it's not the directors that are always right. There's cases of producers that are always right that should never be reined in, where not so much nowadays, but more. And I'm definitely not talking about Kevin Feige, but I'm talking about guys like, David O. Selznick back in the 20s and the 30s. I'm talking about when the studio heads had their finger on the pulse, and they had a very strong instinct. Sometimes it would come from the producer or the studio head, and sometimes it would come from the director. But there are guys in cinema history that you would never want to rein in because they're always 100% right.
I mean, this is
type of
Kubrick's probably level. The best example for that. You just let him do what he does. But yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting observation that even though we like to think that they should be let free reign, basically have 100% their vision, it's not always the best result, and I just think with both Burton and Nolan, having them reined in a bit for Batman was best, because I do think their first films were the best. But quickly going back to what you asked me about Schumacher, I think the design of Gotham in his movies was really interesting, going down the path that you'd like to see for Batman, where it's a lot more fantastical. He had these these giant Greek statues and things. It looked otherworldly. It didn't look like something you see in London or New York or wherever.
It's one of those things. Everything has a basis, right? So everything foils something else or contrasts with something else, and elements of a film play off of each other. So it's not so much that. So, for example, why would I say that Gotham would need to be fantastical and unrecognizable? Because if you're recognizing Chicago or downtown Chicago, that conflicts with what I need you to believe about Batman, right? So the nth degree that he is a martial artist, and it's funny because you mentioned you would focus on 70% psychopath. My interpretation would be 60 to 70% on the fighter. So, the Gotham being unrealistic or unrecognizable lets you know psychologically you're not in a world that you recognize. So you're in a realm where it is possible that a guy could be this good or this effective as a fighter, and because you're not in downtown Chicago and your brain doesn't buy into the setting as familiar, you're like, oh, we're in another world. We're in a narrative. We're in a fiction. We're in a story. And I don't know if you've ever seen this film, the original Frankenstein, the black and white Frankenstein, the very first one.
I don't know if I've seen the very first one. I've seen black and white ones. What era is it from? Like the 20s?
I can't remember
maybe?
if it was the 20s or I think 30s. It was the director that did Invisible Man and the very first Invisible Man
I
or
haven't
Hollow Man, whatever it was.
I haven't seen that one. I know the one you're talking about. Yeah, I haven't seen it.
It was the very first film Frankenstein, right? It was black and white, probably 20s or 30s. And there's a scene in it where Frankenstein, there's a sequence where Frankenstein is being chased by villagers, right?
The monster, you mean?
The monster, yeah, Frankenstein the monster. And, it's that whole pitchfork and chasing Frankenstein type of imagery, but this was the first film where that imagery was done.
Yeah, I know the scene, yeah.
And in that sequence, he goes through a forest, I believe it's a forest, and he's going through and they're chasing him in that sequence. I think it's in the middle of broad daylight, right? And the scope of the forest is huge, right? So this is a huge forest, and the Frankenstein character is pretty big, right? And the amount of people that are chasing him are a good amount of people, right? So that scope of this character, who's a pretty big character, so when you're seeing him normally, he takes up a good amount of the screen. There's a physical stature. When they open up the scope of the environment as he's going through that sequence, and they open up the scope of, because it's such a wide lens and because it's such a wide set design, the amount of people you could have in the mob to contrast the size of the mob chasing this one normally physically imposing character, but compared to the mob, it's in the forest, it looks like a very normal sized character, right?
Yeah.
There's a visual element to that type of storytelling. So if you make a Gotham City fantastical and you make a Gotham City monstrous, right? To me, that makes it more believable that you have a guy that can't be physically touched in hand-to-hand combat. You have a guy that is doing things physically that are incredible, because the city and the setting is incredible. So could an incredible guy come from this incredible city that you can't quite place? And it would be the same with Batman, right? Because you can't quite place his fighting technique. You can't quite place it. It's based in reality, but this is a little bit unrealistic, but it's not too unrealistic to where you clock out and it's ridiculous. It's done in a serious way. So it's almost like that fine line of managing the audience's expectations and getting the audience to buy in to the story and the characters. And the design of Gotham City can make that very difficult for you to do, or it can help you do that. And that's one of the things of why these environments are important. And that was one of the strengths of Batman Forever and Batman and Robin, was the set design.
Yeah. Like, for me, that was easily the best thing in those movies. By the way, I have seen the Frankenstein film you're talking about. I realise which one you're talking about. There are earlier ones, though. There's a few black and white. So I thought you were talking about, like, the ultra early ones.
No, the one that was it was directed by Victor something. I don't know if it's Victor Stolum or something like that, but it's the one where he accidentally kills the little
Yeah.
girl, and then the crowd is
Yeah,
chasing
I've
him.
seen it.
Yeah, great black and white cinematography, and a lot of those early black and white horror films. Frankenstein was one of them. There was another one. I don't remember the name of the film, but I remember there's a scene where there was a character. It takes place in like a castle or something, and it's a very psychological horror type of film. And there's a character that's locked. It was from the 20s or the 30s, and there's a character that's locked up in the top second floor of the castle or something like that. And at the end of the film, he comes out, and man, I can't remember what it was called. It might have been from the same director. I don't know if it was. But a lot of those settings for those early black and white horror films, they're big sets. Like the sets are big and they're monstrous sets. I don't know if it was done that way because it was horror and they needed big sets to kind of visually give it that element. But it's the same type of idea. I would want huge sets, huge and monstrous sets to contrast. You mentioned the DIY, do-it-yourself type of approach and the suit. What do you think of this new suit for the new film coming out, and what do you think in terms of Matt Reeves and what you saw with Planet of the Apes and what you think you're going to see from him with Batman? Is it something you're going to be interested in? Is it something where not so much? And where do you think that's going to fall?
Okay, so right now, that's pretty much the only big budget movie that I'm really interested in ahead of time. And I think Matt Reeves is a capable director, but I don't think he's great. For example, I think Chris Nolan's actually a better director when you watch films like, Memento and, Interstellar, Prestige. Yeah, like I think with, even these Planet of the Apes movies, his two sequels, I don't think were as good as the first movie.
The first one was really good, I thought, as well, but that was a different
Yeah,
director,
exactly.
wasn't it?
I forget his name,
Yeah.
but that for me was the best movie of the trilogy. And again, people really loved his sequels. I think they're okay. It didn't blow me away. Like the first movie, I was like, yeah, this is for today's kind of standards and how big budget movies are approached, especially with, remakes, reboots, sequels, prequels, all this stuff. I thought that was great. So it's weird how I'm really interested in the Batman, except I'm not a huge Matt Reeves fan. I think Pattinson is a very interesting choice because he is, firstly, he's a very good actor. I know a lot of people just dismiss him because of Twilight and that stuff, but he is a good actor, and he's actually taller than he looks. Like to me, he just looks like an average sized guy, but he's I think around like 6'2", something like that. He's quite a tall guy. I don't think he doesn't have the frame, the natural frame in that physique.
Right. He kind of looks like a bat boy.
Yeah.
Like I don't see him as like Batman per se.
If I had cast him in the role because of his acting ability and his look, he's got an interesting look. Like he kind of looks like a sociopath,
A little bit.
I think he would. I'm more interested to see how he plays Bruce Wayne.
And I think he mentioned that's one of the things he found interesting about the character is the psychopathic type of element, him not being a hero, which some people reacted to that.
Yeah, I knew exactly what he was getting at.
You were like, that's the right.
Yeah, it is. But what I would have done if I had cast him is really get him to bulk up, like massively. because that's the other thing as well. Like I talk about how I want this big physical guy to play Batman, but there's not that many actors out there who are like, big name actors who could help fund and sell a movie. It's like when they made Joker, they wrote it with Joaquin in mind, knowing they would be able to make it. Not knowing that they were going to get him, but that was the idea. And if you try to do a Batman movie that way, and you're thinking of a name actor who can help fund this thing and get it sold, there's not that many people who are physically imposing the way I would want them to be. And the ones who aren't particularly good actors.
That's the thing, yeah.
So it is tricky. But if I did use him, I would really get him to bulk up massively, which I don't think they've done from the looks of it. I like the cast in general. I don't know if it has too many villains in it. Usually these things don't work when there are that many villains, but it depends. You could have some of them in just one or two scenes. Like I wouldn't be against doing that.
They could be supporting characters. That's the thing, yeah.
Like in my version of Batman, that I would want to see. Maybe there's a scene with, a Carmine character, but it's like one scene, and whatever happens, whether it involves Batman or not. It's like in, just like, let's say, an original movie, it's a random character for this one scene. In my Batman movie, I can actually give him a name and a look based on a character that, only comic book fans would know, but nonetheless, that character's still in my movie. So the point is, I have no idea how he's going to use all of these characters.
The thing about it is, when you look at the cast, right? There's enough elements there where it's definitely going to be different, and I say that because I don't know all of their names, but the guy he cast as Alfred, definitely different. The guy he cast as Gordon, definitely different. The guy he cast as Batman, Pattinson, it's different enough from what we've seen that you don't really know where it's going to land. And then, Paul Dano, probably similar to what he's done before. Colin Farrell, probably similar to what he's done before. But the three, I should say, that are very interesting, where it really, I think it in a large degree depends on what they do, is Gordon, Alfred, and Bruce Wayne Batman. Because those three actors are a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. So, and one could argue that Gordon, Alfred, and Batman are the main three elements when you look at the protagonist side of things. So, I mean, do you think that's interesting, who they've cast as Alfred and who they've cast as Gordon? And do you think there's a shorthand between the guy that they cast as Alfred because he worked with him as Caesar for the Apes movies, so they know each other already? And is his look combined with Pattinson's look? Because it's a very interesting looking Alfred.
Andy
Serkis, how is that going to affect the Batman? To be honest, like, the guy that's playing Alfred looks a little bit more like he could play Batman than Pattinson. Yeah. So it's interesting in the sense of, what are they going to do with that? Because he doesn't exactly look like a distinguished older butler type of thing of what he's not like Gary Oldman. Not Gary Oldman, Michael Caine. What do you think about that? About the guy who's Gordon, the guy who's Pattinson, and then the guy who's Alfred interacting with each other, and then the guy they cast as Carmine Falcone. I love that actor. What's his name?
John Turturro.
Yeah, he was in Miller's Crossing, and he was in The Big Lebowski. What about him as Carmine Falcone? Because he's an interesting actor as well.
So the first thing is, I completely agree with you. Those, including, I was going to say, John Turturro, those four are the most interesting casting choices.
Definitely eccentric.
Yeah. and I love that they've gone for Jeffrey Wright as Gordon, because it's one of those things where I always say, you know, when race comes into it and they change the character's race or whatever, for me it's always a question of is the character's race important to the character,
not
whether
so
it's
much,
psychology.
not
And
so
that's the
much.
thing with Gordon, it's just not. And the way Jeffrey Wright
But
is,
he Jeffrey Wright has elements and a voice and an acting style
exactly,
and a personality that fits
you
Gordon.
already know more or less what he's going to do, you
Yeah.
know, with that low gravelly voice he has and everything. Like it's I think it's great casting. Andy Serkis, I do think he's there because he's worked with Matt Reeves before and they're friends. Like a lot of you know, people do that even on big movies. They just have a familiar
Are
face around.
right, but are you gonna
Um,
find it strange him being Alfred?
it,
Just the visual, or do you think he'll do a great job?
um, I hope he does a great job.
How
Like it will have.
is it gonna be a different Alfred than we're used to though?
I think so, and I mean, I don't know, but the way I imagined it when they announced Andy Serkis was going to play Alfred is he's more of a background character. This is just what my mind went to. Maybe based on other things I've seen Andy Serkis do, or maybe just the way he looks. I don't know, but I was thinking he will be more like a mentor, a guide, who's like a background father figure. Could be completely wrong. So I don't know. John Turturro I think is really interesting, especially because he's so different from the Batman Begins version of Carmine, who I forget his name, but he's also a very good actor.
Now, John Turturro, there's a couple performances. Sometimes you get the John Turturro that you get in Miller's Crossing. Sometimes you get the John Turturro that you get in Big Lebowski. Is he going to be more towards the dramatic end or more towards the comedic end? Is he going to be somewhere in between? Because he's one of those actors who's very good at both.
Both, yeah. He has. I think he's going to have to be more dramatic here. I can't picture him doing anything comedic. I also think he probably will have a bigger role than people expect, which is why they've cast him. Because if Carmine,
do you think he's going to have a bigger role than say Colin Farrell or Dano, or in terms of the villains? What do you think the hierarchy of screen time is going to be? Do you think it's Paul Dano at the top, Carmine Falcone at the top with the Turo? Do you think it's Colin Farrell or Catwoman at the top? How do you think that's going to break down in terms of screen time?
I think Catwoman will probably get the most screen time of the names you mentioned, but I don't think she's going to be an out-and-out villain. Right. I think she's going to be, you know, an anti-hero, more of a thief. There's going to be, I think she's going to be more of an ally of Batman in this. You know, they're going to have obviously a weird relationship. I don't think she's a straight villain. It's difficult to know what direction they're going to go in. Because there is this feel that they're doing a long Halloween based movie. You know, will they change it so the main bad guy is the Riddler? You know, possibly. I also pictured the Penguin as having more of a supporting role, mainly because initially they were looking at Jonah Hill to play the Penguin.
And that's an interesting thing too, is that Jonah Hill and Colin Farrell are a little bit different, but they were initially looking at him and then they switched to Colin Farrell. So it makes you wonder, what is the take? Because if you were going to go with Jonah Hill, which is one take and one version, and then you went from Jonah Hill to Colin Farrell, did you change what you're doing with the character, or is it the same, but either one of those actors can fill that role? Because they're very different.
Yeah, I think it's the second one, which is why they ended up going for Colin Farrell. which is my reasoning as to why I think he's going to be more of a supporting character, because the reason I believe they moved on from Jonah Hill was he basically asked for more money than they initially offered. So you'd think if he was going to be the main villain of the movie, they would give it to him. They're like, that's the guy I want, because the villain's important, obviously.
He was the first choice, right? We have to assume he was the first choice, and it was a money issue. So let's, like, if we take a step back and we say he's the first choice, let's say money wasn't the issue and they cast him like they originally wanted to do, then you're looking at a cast that's Pattinson, Jonah Hill, Turturro, Serkis as Alfred, and what's his name as Gordon. He fits into the eccentricity. Like, all those 4 or 5 guys are eccentric character actors and very eccentric looking and very specific in terms of the nuance of what they normally do. So we take him out and then you put in Colin Farrell. But if he was in, just those 4 castings alone are very interesting, but they're very similar to each other. They're very similar to each other in how they have a specific look, they have a specific type, they're all kind of eccentric in certain ways. Mm-hmm. Is that a good thing? Because I think that would be interesting for the film. Because that was assuming that was their first approach and their initial approach.
I think that's what they were going for. This is going back to actually what I was going to talk about with this movie and why I'm looking forward to it, even though I'm not the biggest Matt Reeves fan. I like the tone that I'm seeing and hearing, and one of the reasons is that because it's like I said initially, I like the cast, and it's these more kind of left field, slightly eccentric, typically actors, especially with Pattinson. That to me just makes it more interesting. And then once you see the more DIY type Batsuit, and then even the car, mm-hmm. The Batmobile is more along the lines of what I would do. It just, I don't know, tonally it's interesting. Obviously it's not going to be what I want. I don't think they would ever make a movie not for a big budget anyway.
And you know what the interesting thing is? You mentioned this might be based on Long Halloween, and they might change some of the plot, but essentially it might be that format. A lot of the characters in Long Halloween, more than any other Batman story or comic book, the way that they're drawn and the way that they're presented, they're very odd. Like the Riddler in Long Halloween is a very odd Riddler compared to the Riddler you normally get in the comics. Yeah. Most of the characters in Long Halloween, even the Joker in Long Halloween, visually he's a little bit odd in terms of how you would normally see him drawn. It's a very Tim Sale and Jeff Loeb. That was very much the style of that comic book, and the same with Dark Victory with Robin, and the same with the other one. I think they did 3, and that's interesting because the casting matches that type of approach. And there have been rumblings that that's the approach they're taking. But then also, Nolan probably had the best ensemble cast, acting-wise, aside from Matt Reeves, up to this point. But a lot of those actors, they weren't that interesting. They were great actors, but there was not an eccentricity or oddity to them. This cast, they're all great actors, but there's an eccentricity and oddity to them. So it makes you question, is this going to be a little bit of a off-kilter interpretation in that it is the real world, but these performances are a little bit odd. Like they're very nuanced. Like it might be taking the approach that Joker took with Joaquin Phoenix, but for all of the characters, if that makes any sense. Like all of the characters might be very nuanced, specific, odd performances that in an ensemble would work very well together.
I hope that's what they're doing. I do, because I think you're right. I think with Nolan, I mean, the reason he stacked his cast the way he did was he wanted to approach it like Richard Donner's Superman.
Okay.
He was saying, why can't we have all these great actors in smaller roles, like they had Brando, etc. So yeah, randomly, they ended up with Morgan Freeman, and they even had Vodka Hauer randomly in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's like the way it was. I mean, like Lucius Fox, for example, there's just Morgan Freeman, right?
Sure.
There's nothing nuanced about it.
Same with Michael Caine.
Exactly.
Same with
Right.
Carmine Falcone.
Yeah.
The only one is Oldman, but Oldman, anything you put him in, I mean.
Well, he's one of my favorite actors. I mean, as a kid, alongside Daniel Day-Lewis, he was my favorite. One of
He's
the things,
a chameleon.
yeah, one of the things that actually took him down a notch for me and widened the gap against Daniel Day-Lewis was his performance in Nolan's trilogy. I mean, I think in The Dark Knight, his accent actually slips and you hear his real accent, which is the only time I've ever heard that from him.
You do, yeah. There's a couple moments where it slips.
I was shocked because of how good he usually is. And, I don't know why that was the case, but yeah, you'd never get that from Daniel Day-Lewis. Anyway, the point is, yeah, it was a stacked cast, but it was, nothing, like we're saying, nothing nuanced about it. Those actors didn't bring anything special to those characters. They just played them like they always play themselves.
It was very straight. Like it was a good cast, but it was very bland and straight. Yeah. It was like a formal ensemble. Whereas this ensemble, I can't see them playing it that straight.
Yeah, they won't. I mean, I was going to say even Christian Bale is not happy with his performance in that trilogy. I think he was relatively happy with Batman Begins, but he's on record saying he didn't do what he wanted with the character after that.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that he wasn't happy with those two films.
Yeah. I don't think it's just because he feels he was, overshadowed by Heath Ledger and Tom Hardy. I think he's seen them back, and it's not the Batman he wanted to portray. There's probably elements that are to do with the direction and the script and things beyond his control. I mean, for example, even the voice that everyone made fun of wasn't just his voice. It was, tampered with in post-production. So,
tampered in that it was made deeper?
Yeah, yeah. They played around with it to get it the way they wanted, which was silly because no one really liked it. Even people that love The Dark Knight, make fun of it. They should have just let him do the voice he wanted for Batman. But yeah, I do hope what you were saying is the direction they're going in, and it is off kilter, and everyone brings their quirkiness to it. Because yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I'm getting really excited is when they release these images, especially the Batmobile. It's like I said, it's more along the lines of what my take would be, because I would have, my realistic Batman would have something like that. It would be a car he would have had to modify himself in the Batcave, yeah, it's not going to look anything close to what Tim Burton did. Then it's not going to be, a tank that Nolan did. It would be more like this. It would be something similar to what, I mean, you mentioned The Punisher before. Not that I'm a huge fan of the Thomas Jane film, but I remember in that movie, he took a car and he transformed it into his, armored vehicle.
And that's an important part that I think people miss too, is that it's because a lot of people looking at it, there's like, oh, it's like a real car. You know, Batman's supposed to be a genius and billionaire and blah blah blah. But here's the thing: a lot of the things in the Dark Knight and the Dark Knight Rises didn't come from Bruce Wayne. They were given to him or developed for him or Lucius Fox for the most part, right?
Yeah.
So you never, at least for me, I never bought the sense that Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne was an intelligent, genius, involved guy because, quite frankly, I didn't think he was that involved. And between Lucius Fox and between Michael Caine giving him all the advice and between Gordon, to me, he came across not that capable. As just anything other than a regular guy with technology and people helping him. With this version, people look at the car and then they say, oh, well, that looks like a regular car that's been modified. Yeah, but here's the thing. If, like you say, that those modifications and that involvement and that development of the car comes directly from Bruce Wayne or from Pattinson in the cave doing it himself, that's already a good thing for the character because he's already more involved than we've normally seen Batman to be. Like if that car comes from someone giving him that car, it's not really a great thing because yeah, he's a billionaire. Someone should be giving him a better car, right? But if that car comes from him and what we're seeing is literally a product of his efforts, then that's a strength because it's coming from him, right?
Exactly,
which means.
Yeah.
He has some capability, right? You know, like there's some direct involvement. Now, the other interesting thing is, if I had to look at the characters visually, and I had to look at Pattinson visually, and I had to look at not Michael Caine, Andy Serkis as Alfred visually, honestly, I think, and this is a hunch, I could be wrong, I think the car comes from Alfred. I think visually the way Andy Serkis looks as Alfred, I could see him making this car more than I could see Pattinson as Bruce Wayne making this car. So I think that's going to be Alfred's involvement. I think he's going to be different. And I think it might not be a wrong assumption to say that the Bat cycle and the Bat car and the suit comes from Alfred. Or I should say Andy Serkis as Alfred. That might be the take. The take might be that they might take it that this Alfred had a military background and that's how he's helping Pattinson develop into Batman. And a lot of this tech and a lot of this stuff is coming from him doing the modifications. Sort of like a hybrid of, because I know there's no Lucius Fox, but sort of like a hybrid of this Alfred is sort of taking some of those aspects.
Very possibly. And that would be in line with what Darren Aronofsky was going to do before Chris Nolan made Batman Begins.
In terms of Alfred, he was going to do that?
Yeah. So before Batman Begins, the studio was developing a reboot that would have been called Batman Year One. Mm-hmm. And it, just like Batman Begins, where it used elements from, Frank Miller's comic, it would have done that, but it was wildly different. And Aronofsky wanted to do a even more realistic take than what Nolan did. I don't know if it was as realistic as what I want to do, where it's more of a character study, but he wanted to go down that path. So Alfred wasn't even called Alfred, and he wasn't British. He was called Big Al.
Big Al.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was a mechanic, and he's the guy who basically, builds and maintains the car and the bike for him and stuff like that. Helps him with his
interesting. They might be going that route.
Yeah, so they might have got it from that, because that was close to going into production. Like there's a pattern with Aronofsky where he's, like with Wolverine and Robocop, he's developed these things, they're close to going into production, then they fall apart. But obviously there's elements, this is usually the case anyway, usually elements from those abandoned films don't get abandoned. Elements do get used in other takes. So it's possible that's where they've got it from. Although there is something that Aronofsky was going to do. Like, people really hated Aronofsky's script. Fans, Batman fans, once they got a hold of. I don't think the whole thing's out there, but I think there's like excerpts from it and notes and things like that you can see. But one of the things he did that I disagree with as well is he took Bruce's money away from him. So basically, board members at Wayne Enterprises after his parents' death basically found a way to take away Bruce's stake in the company. So he ends up as like a street urchin, and I don't know if there was a Batcave, because this whole relationship he has with the Big Al character, I think mostly took place in a garage, a mechanic's garage. That I don't like, because even in my version, this is interesting because it ties into what we're talking about, the suit and the car and all that, and how different it is from Nolan's version. He would have to be a billionaire because it's the perfect cover for people to not think Bruce Wayne and Batman are the same person. Aside, like, the main two things that my version of Batman would benefit from being a billionaire is it helps with the disguise, and B, he doesn't need generating an income or paying bills or any of that type of stuff. That's all automated. He can just focus on this weird psychopathic childhood fantasy based on the trauma he's experienced.
Because as a billionaire, he would already be detached and living a certain type of life.
Yeah.
And who would think a billionaire is going to dress up as a bat and go into the streets to beat people up and get beaten up?
We're talking about a guy who spends his time in a cave training martial arts and investigating crimes. He's basically living a weird, fucked up fantasy.
He would have to be wealthy.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. It's there. So I didn't like that Aronofsky took that aspect away from him. The thing you're talking about with Alfred being, his mechanic / armor, whatever, was very possible because it was in that script. So they might have got the idea from there.
Well, it's also that's just the look of Andy Serkis. Yeah. Like, he has a very rough look, so it's like I can't see this guy being the traditional, proper gentleman butler type of thing. And he's not that old. He's pretty fit. I mean, he's in pretty good shape. He's actually in better shape than Pattinson from the looks of it. So, yeah, he could be more involved in that than we've normally seen Alfred be involved. And the fact that there's no Lucius Fox, the fact that Bruce Wayne is so young, there has to be a brains behind the operation, right? So in Dark Knight Rises, the brains was essentially sort of a combination between Lucius Fox, Michael Caine, and Bruce Wayne was like the executable aspect of it, but it was like a dynamic. With this, looking at it, of the two of them, when I look at visually Robert Pattinson, he looks young. He looks like he would be making mistakes. And then when I look at Andy Serkis, visually, I'm like, yeah, this is the brains. Like, Andy Serkis looks like he would be the brains. Like, and I think because of the comfort that Matt Reeves has with him and working with him before, he will not just have a small part. I think it's going to be almost as big of a part as Pattinson because they'll have a lot of scenes together. Yeah. But when you look at the Dark Knight Rises, Michael Caine and Lucius Fox were in like every scene that Bruce Wayne was in. So they had like Michael Caine had more wisdom than was coming from Bruce Wayne, Christian Bale in those films. So I think Andy Serkis is going to be very involved in this film. I think he's going to be very involved in the suit, the car, the bike, Pattinson's mistakes, things that are going on. I think he's going to really be like the head of the operation until Pattinson develops as Batman, and that's kind of the approach that they're going to take. I don't think it's going to start with Pattinson looking that young and being super capable right off the bat.
Right. I do. I think you're right. Because, like, the main reason is you're not going to cast a friendly face, someone you're familiar with, to be around on set if you're not going to use them that much. Serkis has to be there for the majority of filming as a kind of a comfort to Matt Reeves. I mean, this happens a lot on movies like this. It's not anything new, and it's not anything negative.
Well, it was the same with Nolan and Michael Caine. He had him in The Prestige. Yeah. They worked with each other before, and it's also Andy Serkis is a really good actor. It's the type of thing that when you look at the cast, I think he's one of the stronger actors in that cast.
Yeah, he is. Like, based on their ages and their body of work, I would have to say him and Jeffrey Wright. I think Pattinson can get. I mean, obviously Turturro is a great actor as well. Obviously, he's done a lot of silly things like Transformers and whatnot. So
God.
You can't.
I totally forgot.
Automatically put him in the same category, but I think Pattinson can reach that as he gets older and he does more, roles. Because after
Serkis,
Twilight, he's been choosing good roles. But go ahead, Serkis.
He's developing as an actor, so he's if they do a second or third film, he's only going to benefit from working with Jeffrey Wright and working with Andy Serkis. He's only going to get better. But the other thing is that Serkis is in a very interesting place because not only is he playing Alfred, but he's also directing Venom 2.
Oh yeah.
So it puts him in an interesting place creatively because he's going to have his directorial debut, and usually actors turn directors. Usually they're pretty good directors for the most part, as long as they were pretty decent actors. So he's in an interesting place because he's directing now. He's going to be directing, so I think he's going to be very involved to learn more from Reeves as he's directing. And at the same time, Reeves has worked with him before. So I think Andy Serkis is going to be one of the biggest screen times, but also one of the biggest indicators for the tone of the film. I think it's going to be Andy Serkis more than because Jeffrey Wright, you know what you're going to get. You could tell he's coming off of Westworld, so okay, he's a good Gordon. You have an idea what it's going to look like. Paul Dano, you know what for the most part that's going to look like as the Riddler. Yeah. Colin Farrell, I think he's going to be supporting. I don't think he's going to have a big role. Catwoman, you know what you're going to get, kind of from what she looks like visually, her haircut that she just got, and some of the stuff that she's been doing. Pattinson, obviously that's the biggest question mark in that he's a good actor, but people want to see what he does with Bruce Wayne and Batman. So that's more of like what is he going to do? What's his take, right? Mm-hmm. But then when you look at the two knowns or the three knowns, it's Turturro, Jeffrey Wright, and Andy Serkis. And of those three, who's the closest to the Batman character? Andy Serkis. And who's the closest to the director? Andy Serkis. So just like Michael Caine was like a huge barometer for Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises and Batman Begins even, Andy Serkis I think is going to be the same thing for this trilogy. I think he's going to be as big as Michael Caine was in those films.
Yeah, I think you're completely right on that. Don't even think it's a question, to be honest. It's you just laid
it's
it out.
It's a question in what the interpretation is. He's going to have a role, but what is his take?
Yeah,
that's
exactly. Yeah.
That's it. Is it like a Big Al type of thing where, like you said, we're going to see him as like a completely different departure from the character, or is it going to have elements of that mixed with some other stuff?
Yeah, I don't think they would be bold enough to completely change up. I wouldn't. Even in my like ultra realistic version, he would still ultimately be the butler who's more than a butler. Obviously, this surrogate father figure. But yeah, I do think it's very possible that, like you said, they using him to fill the Lucius Fox character as well, and also elements from Batman himself, which is disappointing for the type of Batman I want to see. I mean, and you touched on this before, because, you know, like in my version, you know, he has to modify the car himself. You know, he has to build the suit himself. This is part of his weird, you know, psychopathic fantasy that he
Mm-hmm.
has. You know, he's not just going to order these things, or get Lucius to build them, or give him these rejected military prototypes. And you know, this is a guy who, you know, he's obsessed. You know, and he has to do these things himself. And again, like you said, it also shows his